Let us pray. Gracious and loving God, your word has been read and it is about to be proclaimed. We ask now that you would open our hearts and minds by the power and inspiration of your Holy Spirit, that we might hear a word from you today. Amen. In today's reading from the book of Exodus, Moses is standing on the edge of one of the most important assignments in history. He has been tasked with going before Pharaoh and saying, "Let my people go free." But Moses hesitates. He starts making excuses. He says, "I'm unskilled. Why would Pharaoh listen to me?" Now, this isn't the first time that he raised the objection. As Pastor Bo was taking us through a really quick history of Moses' story to make sure we have it in context, you may remember that when Moses stood before the burning bush, this first encounter that Moses had with God, that's when he began to make mistakes. That's a Freudian slip. That's when he began to make excuses and to say, "Please send someone else." And he continues to ask God to send someone instead of him. He feels unable to rise to the task that is before him, and his anxiety keeps circling back, fixating on his weaknesses, his past failures, and how strong Pharaoh is compared to him. Now, we may not be called to stand before a Pharaoh literally, but we know the weight of anxiety that makes us doubt our capacity and God's ability to carry us through something that feels bigger than we are. We know how anxiety causes our hearts to race and our palms to sweat, and how we want to come up with reasons that we shouldn't do whatever it is that we are feeling led to do. Maybe it's having that hard conversation that we've been avoiding, or saying yes to something that's been asked of us that we're just not sure that we are equipped to do. There are times when speaking up for what is right just seems scary and we don't know how it's going to turn out. Or when the powers of evil and oppression seem so much bigger and we feel so tiny in comparison. Last week, we continued to explore what's called this body-mind dance, when our body screams to us that we are in danger and we need to run away or to freeze. And we're trying to figure out together how we learn to recognize when that alarm is a false alarm, when we don't need to run away. But when anxiety sets in, this is what we considered last week. Anxiety is not the real enemy. It's the story we tell ourselves about whatever is going to happen. It's the story that we tell ourselves about our inadequacies. It's the story we tell ourselves when we take God out of the story and we think everything is up to us and there's just no way that we can handle whatever the situation is. And when anxiety rises, fear does what fear always does. It magnifies the obstacle and it minimizes God's presence. It says, run, retreat, keep your mouth shut. And every time we listen to that story, then our brain learns, see, there really was danger there. And we continue in this loop. But exposure inhibition, this is a psychological term, flips the script. It says, don't run, don't retreat, do the hard thing anyway. And over time, when we practice this, our brains learn the alarm was false, the fear was lying. That's what Moses and Aaron lived. They didn't go before Pharaoh one time. They didn't even go 2 times. They went 10 times. 10 times they showed up. 10 times they faced down fear. And each time, and I am reading this into the text, but I believe it's true, each time they went, their trust in God got a little bit louder than the anxiety in their heads as they continued to take the one step that God put in front of them. So how do we follow their example? How do we do this in real life? How do we take steps when anxiety feels absolutely overwhelming? Well, today I'm going to give us 5 tools, and I'm going to encourage you to listen to the one that speaks to you. And yes, that's why I'm behind the pulpit, because 5 is a lot to remember with different parts. But the first one is Mel Robbins' Let Them, Let Me theory. The second is a slight modification of her theory, which is the ABC process, which is to assess the situation, break the cycle, and choose what we're going to do. The third exercise is Henry Cloud's 2 columns exercise that leads us through figuring out what we can and cannot control. The fourth is learning how to challenge what I'm going to call the helpless bias, where we replace nothing can be done with what step can I take. And the fifth and final is the 5-second rule. So again, you don't have to remember all of these. I will be happy to share any information with you if any particular tool speaks to you. But the very first step we take in learning how to manage our anxiety, and the step that these others are going to reinforce, is learning this truth. We cannot control outcomes. We can only do our part. Moses and Aaron could not control what Pharaoh would do. What they could control was whether or not they showed up, whether or not they spoke the words that God had given them to speak. This is such a hard lesson for us to learn, friends, because we are hardwired with a need for control. Feeling in control makes us feel comfortable and safe. And yet, most therapists would agree, the source of most life stress and unhappiness is the energy we waste trying to control things that are fundamentally beyond our ability to control. In the words of one of my favorite psychologists, Henry Cloud, feeling responsible for other people's feelings and lives will make you nuts, which is a technical word for anxious. So if we don't want to be nuts, then we have to master this first step. Now, if we were the sort of church where I could say, turn to your neighbor and say this, I would do this, but don't worry, some of you just got anxious. I'm not going to do that. What I am going to do is ask you to repeat this truth mentally. We cannot control or change another person. Y'all got that? We cannot control or change another person. We can only control or change ourselves. Can't change somebody else, can change me. Mel Robbins describes this in her best-selling book, Let Them, and the book opens with a story about her son's prom. She had 2 daughters who had gone to proms. She had attended to all the details, the perfect dress, the perfect flowers, made sure, talked to the mothers that there were the perfect reservations, all the perfect things for the perfect date. And her son decided at the last minute, yeah, I think I'll go. He and his friends decided. He asked somebody he didn't know that well. She was happy to be asked. And Mel Robbins swooped in and tried to take charge to make all of the plans that he had made. And so she began to obsess. She was worried about the flowers. She spent half a day trying to get the perfect corsage for the date to wear. She asked him questions about the dress, and he was getting really frustrated with her, but she drove across town, she had it, and then he'd said, Mom, she doesn't want it. She showed up and realized that her son's date had made her own corsage, and so then she had two, and she had to figure out what to do. And it just went from bad. Then she asked about the reservations, and son said, I don't have any. I think we're going to go to this Mexican place. And she was like, that's only a taco stand. They're in these fine clothes. They're going to get stuff all over them. She was just so absolutely panicked. And then to make things worse, it started raining. And so she tried to take control of the situation. And her daughter said, who was with her, said, Mom, let them decide what they are going to do. And she said her brain flipped at that moment. She took a deep breath. She gave her son $40 so he could have something to pay for supper, and she left. And she's turned that experience into a multi-million-dollar enterprise and best-selling book. Pretty amazing. But that exchange shifted everything for her. And this is the same lesson, friends, that God was trying to teach Moses before Moses ever stood in Pharaoh's court. Moses wanted to have control. He wanted to speak well. He wanted to have all the answers. He wanted to know what the outcome would be. But God's call was not to fix everything yourself. God's call was go where I send you, say what I give you, and trust that I will do the rest. Let them is not just good advice for parenting or for daily life. It's the posture of faith before a God who calls us to act where we can and to let God handle what is beyond our control. And I do realize if you're parenting younger children, this doesn't necessarily apply in full force. We're talking about adults. Just want you to know I don't have children, but I did catch that. So, here's some common things that we cannot control that we want to think that we can control. We cannot control what other people think about us. We just can't do it. We can try to give them reasons to think good things about us, but we cannot control what other people think about us. People are going to have negative thoughts about us. I mean, as amazing and wonderful as I am, there are people who have negative thoughts about me. There are even people that don't like me that much. I can't imagine why. But it's just a reality. And if we try to win universal approval, we are going to drive ourselves absolutely crazy and spend all sorts of energy that could be spent better in a different way. We can't control the outcomes of our hard work. We can study really hard for an exam if you're in school, but you cannot control the grade that you get. You do your part, but whether or not that essay you wrote resonates with the professor, that's beyond your control once you've done your best. We can't control whether or not we get a promotion at work. We just make sure that we show up and that we work hard. The results are never ours to control. It's only the faithfulness and the effort that we bring that we can control. We can't control whether or not other people follow the rules. We may follow them, but that doesn't guarantee that everybody else will. And trying to police everybody else's behavior only exhausts us. We can't control political outcomes either, friends. We can vote, we can advocate, we can pray, but the results of elections and legislations are not in our hands alone. So, if we cannot control outcomes, other people's choices, and every anxious thought that runs through our minds, what can we control? Well, we can control how we respond, and we can choose to learn skills that help us respond differently. I've already referenced the let them theory, but the let them, let me power move goes like this. Let them make their decisions. Let me take control of my response and choose what I do next. Mel Robbins describes it as the seesaw. Let them make their decisions, and then let me choose my response. This move allows us to experience empowerment over victimhood. The example she puts in her book is that she saw on social media that a group of her friends went on a trip without her, and her initial response was to be really hurt. And then she took a deep breath and said, let them make that decision. And then she tried to evaluate what she could do, and she landed on, let me try to be a better friend and to strengthen friendships. But she gave up obsessing over the choice that they'd made. Just last week, she lifted up Taylor Swift as an example of this. You may have seen, you may not have seen, but Taylor Swift dropped the news that she has a new album coming out. And Mel Robbins said, Taylor Swift knows it best. Your life will change when you stop chasing approval and start choosing yourself. Let them gossip, let them criticize, let them misunderstand you. You don't owe anyone your time, your peace, or your explanation, because every second that you spend trying to convince someone who's already decided against you, well, that's time and energy wasted. Let them be wrong about you. Let me get back to doing what I was put on earth to do. She then added, if there's one thing that Taylor proves again and again, it's this. You can't control what they say, but you can control what you create. So that's the let them, let me. Now, another variation of this is this ABC loop for stressful situations, where A is assess. What can I control? What can I not control? B, break the cycle. Take a deep breath and say, let them. And C, choose our response. What serves my goals? What maintains my power? Then there's Henry Cloud's 2-column exercise. This is when you have a little more time and you have the ability to write things down. But Dr. Cloud suggests to make 2 columns, things we can control and things we cannot control. So things we cannot control, column 1, are those things that we can't control right now, but for which we feel responsible and about which we are worried. And that might be relatives or extended family, any other person, the future. And then, once we have our column of things we cannot control, we set a time, maybe 10 minutes, and worry about this list all we want to. We give ourselves permission to worry. And then we turn it over to God. We surrender it to God. Now, there's actually science that backs up that can be helpful to set a worry time, to say, this still feels really big to me. I'm going to go back and worry about this again next week for 10 minutes, whatever time. And we do this until we begin to have peace about all of those things that we cannot control. We practice worrying and we practice surrendering them to God. This is not a helpful tool for everyone. If you try this and you find it just triggers your anxiety some more because you're not able to do that second stop of surrendering, don't use this tool. And the disclaimer that I would make here is twofold. Sometimes it's helpful to actually do an historical audit of things we can control and things we could not have controlled, but those things that we feel responsible for. A family member's choices, a loved one's suffering, even abuse that we suffered. Naming those responsibilities can free us. But sometimes we need additional help, and this is something you will again hear me say over and over. There are times and situations that the weight is too much for us to carry alone, and some of these tools may be helpful, but we really need a trained therapist to help us achieve the healing that God desires in our lives. But we've got column 1, and then we move on to column 2. The things that we can control: our own actions, our work and family commitments, learning new things, treating our anxiety, steps that improve our life and draw us closer to what matters most. And once we've named what we can control, we can look at our list and pick one thing. Don't pick all 10 that you wrote down. Pick one thing, put a star next to it, and ask, what's the smallest step I can take right now to address this? And we do this over and over again so that we're able to manage those things that are ours to manage. And over time, this helps us cultivate agency, our ability to recognize the power that we have in any given situation, and resilience, like Moses and Aaron kept going before God. We learn that we can push through difficult things, we can recognize what is ours, and we can let go of what is not ours. And then, this practice actually prepares us to confront bigger problems, those that at first glance seem beyond us, challenges within our communities or our nation, or even sometimes conflicts around the globe. Now, feeling stressed or anxious in face of some of the really big problems, friends, is natural and healthy. It says we have a brain, okay? It's just we don't want to get stuck in those feelings of anxiety that zap us and keep us from responding to God's call upon our lives. If we saw an individual hurting, we would do whatever was in our power to help that person. I believe that. But sometimes when the problem seems so big, we think there's absolutely nothing I can do. And that's simply not true. That's another lie that we tell ourselves. There's always some small step that we can take. And the way that we can identify this is by asking ourselves, what do I wish everybody else would do? What do I wish everybody else would do confronted with this? And then we think, well, based on that, what's one small step that I can take? And we figure out that there are things that we can do. Now, we have a tendency as humans to love the grand gestures and to look and to say, look at Moses and Aaron going forth 80 and 83, still learning this lesson, by the way, but 80 and 83, going forth and speaking on God's behalf. And when we focus on the grand gestures, we lose sight of the fact sometimes that so often in the course of history, change occurs through multiple people making small actions. And it's those small actions that end up turning the tide. God takes our small acts and weaves them into the greater work of the Spirit. This doesn't happen overnight, but as Martin Luther King Jr. reminded us during the Civil Rights Movement, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. But how do we move when we feel paralyzed? Okay, this is the fifth and final skill that I have for you, and it's the 5-second rule. Going back to Mel Robbins. She, at one point in her life, was drowning in debt, $800,000 in debt, borrowed money from family and friends. Husband was out of work. She didn't want to get out of bed every morning. It was just too much. But she woke up one morning and she remembered that the night before she had watched a rocket launch. And she decided that she was going to be a rocket. And so she counted back in her mind, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, out. And she got out of bed. And she learned she could apply that rule, the 5-second rule, to other situations. When she was thinking, I don't want to do this, she could say 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, act. And she later learned that there's science behind this. Now, you have to go back to the very first sermon that I preached in this series and remember that we have the amygdala, that little almond-sized thing in our brain that's telling us, this is danger, slow down, don't act, don't act. But we want to engage the prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain that is capable of rational thinking. And when we count and act, we stop the spiral because we engage that prefrontal cortex. And it works in all sorts of situations. If we give ourselves time to think about doing something, we will talk ourselves out of it. It will seem too hard, too big, not worth it. Friends, we're all good at making excuses, just like Moses. And so the final invitation there is think of yourself as a rocket. Now, I told you I was going to talk about a lot of tools today, and my Fitbit has warned me that I am needing to draw this sermon to a close, so I'm going to. The invitation is to go back and figure out which one of these tools, don't try to follow all 5 this week, but which one of these tools speaks the most to you and anxiety that you are facing, and then apply it and just see what God does with that. Friends, God's call upon our lives is too big for us to be held hostage by anxiety. We may not be able to silence every anxious thought, but we can take the next faithful step. We can speak when anxiety tells us to stay silent. We can move forward when fear urges us to retreat. Step by step, choice by choice, we can reclaim the ground that anxiety has tried to steal. And when we allow God to direct our steps, the courage that helps us face that one difficult conversation can help us face injustice. The persistence that helps us confront a private fear can lead us to resist the powers that oppress. The God who called Moses still calls us not to be fearless, but to take the next faithful step and to trust God with the outcomes. The good news for us today is that the God who carried Moses and Aaron before Pharaoh is the same God who sustained Martin Luther King Jr., who once observed, "There are times when I get despondent and wonder if it is worth it, but then something says to me deep down within, God is able." And that same God speaks to us today, saying, I am able. No matter what we face, hear this truth. God is able. God is able to carry us through our fear. God is able to help us confront injustice. God is able to bring peace into our hearts and minds. God is able to work through us to do abundantly more than we dare dream or imagine. God is able, and our superpower rests in God. May we trust that truth, and may we not only trust it, but may we live it. Amen.